Introduction: the hole that should not exist. For as long as humans have walked the earth, we have feared what lies beneath our feet. The ground appears solid, dependable, yet history reminds us that beneath the surface, there are voids, caverns, and depths that defy explanation. Occasionally, stories emerge of places so strange that they challenge not only science, but our understanding of reality itself. One such story surfaced in the late 1990s, buried in the remote hills of central Washington state. It was a story of a hole, perfectly round, eerily silent, and seemingly without end. Anything thrown into it vanished. No sound returned, no echo, no confirmation that a bottom had ever been reached. The man who brought this story to the world called himself Mel Waters. In 1997, Mel phoned into the late-night radio program Coast to Coast AM, a show known for exploring the unexplained. What followed was not an emotional confession or an exaggerated tale, but a calm, methodical account delivered with unsettling sincerity. Mel claimed he owned land near Ellensburg, Washington, and on that land was a pit so deep that tens of thousands of feet of line could be lowered without resistance. At first, it sounded like folklore, another curious story destined to fade into late-night radio history. But as Mel continued to speak, the details became harder to dismiss. Animals refused to approach the hole. Radios behaved erratically, broadcasting voices and music from decades past. Neighbors whispered of a dead dog that had somehow returned. Then came the most disturbing claims of all: military intervention, forced secrecy, and Mel's sudden disappearance from public life. Was Mel's hole an elaborate hoax, a misunderstood natural phenomenon, or evidence of something that should not exist at all? Nearly 3 decades later, the hole, real or imagined, continues to haunt those who hear its story, not because it has been proven, but because it has never been fully explained. And some mysteries, once spoken aloud, refuse to stay buried. Chapter 1: Mankind's Fascination with the Abyss. Long before humanity had satellites, seismographs, or an understanding of plate tectonics, people looked at the ground beneath their feet with both trust and terror. The earth was solid until it wasn't. It provided shelter, food, and life, yet it also concealed unknown depths that could swallow animals, villages, and even entire civilizations without warning. From the earliest days of human history, deep holes in the ground were never viewed as ordinary geological features. They were thresholds. Across cultures and continents, pits, caves, and chasms were imagined as gateways to somewhere else. Sometimes they led to the realm of the dead, sometimes to divine judgment, sometimes to places that existed outside time itself. The deeper the void, the greater the fear, and the greater the meaning imposed upon it. In ancient mythology, the underworld was rarely accessed through grand doors or towering gates. More often, it was reached through the earth itself. In Greek tradition, entrances to Hades were said to exist in remote caves and fissures. The Romans believed certain volcanic vents were mouths of the god Pluto. To stand near such places was to stand at the edge of another reality, one governed by rules entirely different from those of the surface world. This belief was not merely symbolic. In what is now modern-day Turkey, the ancient city of Hierapolis housed one of the most infamous abyssal sites in recorded history, the Plutonian. This cave was believed to be a literal entrance to the underworld. Ancient writers described how animals brought near its mouth would collapse and die almost instantly, while birds flying overhead would fall from the sky. Priests alone were said to possess the knowledge, or divine protection, necessary to approach it safely. For centuries, ritual sacrifices were performed there, reinforcing the idea that the earth itself could kill, judge, or consume. Modern science eventually revealed that the Plutonian emitted lethal concentrations of carbon dioxide, pooling invisibly near the ground. But for those who lived thousands of years ago, there was no chemical explanation, only the certainty that something beneath the earth was hostile to life. Similar beliefs emerged throughout medieval Europe. In the forests and mountains of what is now the Czech Republic stands Hauska Castle, a fortress unlike any other. Built in the 13th century, it occupies an otherwise unremarkable landscape, far from trade routes, water sources, or strategic value. Legends claim it was constructed not to defend against invaders, but to seal a bottomless pit believed to lead directly to hell. Architectural oddities fuel the mystery. Many of the castle's fortifications face inward, as though designed to keep something contained rather than to keep enemies out. A chapel was built directly over the alleged pit, perhaps as a final spiritual barrier. Stories tell of condemned prisoners lowered into the chasm only to be pulled back up screaming, aged, or driven mad. Whether folklore or fear-induced hallucination, the message was clear. Some depths were not meant to be explored. As civilization advanced, explanations replaced gods and demons. The abyss became a subject of science rather than superstition. Geology offered rational accounts of sinkholes, lava tubes, and cavern systems. But even as knowledge expanded, the unease remained. The deeper humans drilled, the hotter and more unstable the earth became. Mines collapsed, wells ran dry or filled with toxic gases. The planet revealed itself as layered, pressurized, and fundamentally inhospitable beyond a certain depth. Yet curiosity persisted. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, speculation about the Earth's interior took on new forms. Some theorists proposed that the planet was hollow, containing entire worlds within. Others imagined vast subterranean oceans, ancient civilizations, or even advanced beings living far below the surface. While most of these ideas were dismissed by mainstream science, they found fertile ground in popular culture. Jules Verne's journey to the center of the Earth captured the imagination of millions, reinforcing the idea that the descent itself, rather than the destination, was the true adventure. Psychologists have since suggested that humanity's fixation on deep holes is not accidental. The abyss represents the unknown in its purest form. Unlike distant stars or unexplored oceans, it is directly beneath us, hidden by only a thin layer of soil. It challenges the illusion of stability. To imagine a bottomless hole is to imagine the failure of the world's most basic promise, that the ground will hold. This fear is deeply ingrained. Children instinctively fear falling into darkness. Dreams of endless descent are among the most common anxiety-related experiences reported across cultures. In these dreams, there is no impact, only falling, weightless, and eternal. The terror does not come from injury, but from the absence of an end. Modern physics has only complicated the matter. Concepts like space-time distortion, gravitational wells, and event horizons have given scientific language to ideas once considered purely mythical. Black holes, though vastly different in scale, have become cosmic analogs of the ancient abyss, regions where known laws of reality break down. Information disappears, time slows, observation becomes impossible. Against this backdrop, stories of bottomless pits take on new resonance. They no longer need to be entrances to hell to be terrifying. They merely need to exist outside explanation. This is why the story of Mel's Hole struck such a nerve when it emerged in the late 20th century. It did not arrive wrapped in ancient myth or religious symbolism. It appeared in a world of satellites, GPS, and geological surveys, a world confident that nothing on Earth remained truly unknown. And yet, it echoed every ancient fear humanity had ever attached to the abyss. A perfectly round hole, no sound, no bottom. It was not the depth alone that disturbed people. It was the implication that beneath the familiar surface of the modern world, there might still exist places where the rules do not apply. Places that resist measurement, places that react to life itself. If history teaches us anything, it is that whenever humanity encounters such depths, we instinctively assign them meaning. We call them sacred, or cursed, or forbidden. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: the abyss does not call to us because it is empty, but because something might be looking back. Chapter 2: The Phone Call That Started Everything, 1997. Late-night radio has always occupied a strange space in the modern world. It exists in the quiet hours, when cities sleep, highways stretch endlessly into darkness, and listeners are left alone with their thoughts. It is during these hours that people are most willing to consider ideas they would dismiss in daylight. And no program embodied this liminal state better than Coast to Coast AM. By the mid-1990s, the show, hosted by the unmistakable voice of Art Bell, had become a cultural phenomenon. Broadcasting from the Nevada desert, Bell invited conversations about UFOs, government conspiracies, time travel, cryptids, and the unexplained. Skeptics listened alongside believers. Scientists listened alongside mystics. What mattered was not certainty, but curiosity. Art Bell had heard thousands of strange stories. He was difficult to shock. Then, on the evening of February 21st, 1997, the phone lines opened, and a man calling himself Mel Waters changed everything. From the moment Mel began to speak, there was something unusual about him. He did not sound excited, nervous, or theatrical. There was no attempt to dramatize his account. He spoke slowly, carefully, and with a tone more consistent with a landowner describing a fence dispute than someone recounting a paranormal anomaly. Mel told Art Bell that he owned a parcel of land roughly 9 miles west of Ellensburg, Washington, in a sparsely populated, heavily forested region. Tucked away on this remote property was something he referred to simply as the hole. At first, the description seemed unremarkable. According to Mel, the hole was about 9 feet in diameter, roughly circular and lined with stones near its opening. It did not appear on any official maps. No one he spoke to knew who dug it or when it had been created. It had simply always been there. But as Mel continued, it became clear that this was no ordinary well. The locals, he explained, had used the hole as a dumping ground for decades. Rather than hauling trash into town, people threw unwanted items into the pit. Garbage, broken appliances, furniture, scrap metal, even the carcasses of dead animals. Over the years, an extraordinary amount of material had been discarded into the hole, yet it never filled. More disturbing still, nothing thrown into it ever produced a sound. No thud, no splash, no echo. Art Bell, intrigued, pressed Mel for clarification. Was it possible that the sound simply didn't carry? Was there water at the bottom? A slope? Mel responded that he had considered all of those possibilities, and that was precisely why he began experimenting. Mel explained that he was not a scientist, but he was methodical. He wanted to know how deep the hole really was. So he took what he had on hand, a spool of high-tensile fishing line, weighted with a lead sinker. Slowly, carefully, he lowered it into the darkness. The line paid out smoothly. There was no resistance. When the spool ran out, the sinker had not hit bottom. Mel went inside, tied on another spool, and continued. Then another, and another. By his estimate, he eventually lowered tens of thousands of feet of line into the hole, later claiming a total exceeding 80,000 feet, more than 15 miles, without ever reaching the end. Throughout the process, there was no vibration, no tension change, no indication that the weight had encountered anything at all. To Art Bell, this claim bordered on the impossible. He challenged Mel gently but persistently. Fishing line, after all, had weight. At such depths, it should snap under its own mass. Heat from the Earth's crust should melt it. And no known geological structure could remain open at such a depth without collapsing. Mel acknowledged these objections, but insisted that the hole did not behave like anything he understood. Then he mentioned the animals. Mel explained that his dogs reacted violently whenever they approached the pit. They refused to get close, barking aggressively at what appeared to be empty air. Sometimes they snapped or bit as if something invisible surrounded the opening. Birds avoided the area entirely. Mel could not recall seeing insects near the hole at all. This alone would have been enough to unsettle many listeners. But Mel continued. One day, he brought a portable radio with him while visiting the hole. As he moved closer to the edge, the signal degraded into static. When he stepped back, the broadcast returned to normal. When he stepped closer again, the radio changed channels on its own. At one point, Mel claimed he heard old-time music, the kind no longer played on modern stations. On another channel, he heard a baseball game. Curious, he listened closely. The game, he later realized, had been played decades earlier, in the 1960s. To many listeners, this was the moment the story crossed from strange to deeply disturbing. Interference was one thing, but apparent broadcasts from the past suggested something else entirely, something involving time itself. Art Bell was silent for a moment before responding. When he did speak, his voice carried an unfamiliar edge of caution. He had heard many accounts involving strange signals, but rarely had they been delivered with such composure. As the conversation continued, Mel revealed that he had spoken with his neighbors about the hole. That was when he learned the most chilling story of all. One neighbor admitted that, years earlier, his dog had died. Not wanting to dig a grave, he threw the animal into the hole. Several days later, while walking in the woods, he encountered a dog that looked exactly like his own. Same size, same markings, same collar. When he called out, the dog looked at him and ran away. The call lasted over an hour. When it finally ended, Art Bell thanked Mel for sharing his experience and moved on to the next segment of the show. At the time, he likely assumed this would be just another strange story among many, one that listeners would debate briefly before forgetting. He was wrong. The phone lines lit up, letters poured in, listeners demanded updates, and Mel, to Art Bell's surprise, called back, again and again. Over the next several years, Mel Waters would become one of the most talked about recurring callers in coast-to-coast AM history. With each appearance, his story expanded. New details emerged, and soon, what began as an odd geological mystery would evolve into something far more dangerous. Because once Mel spoke about the hole publicly, it seemed that someone, or something, began listening. And the consequences of that first phone call were only just beginning. Chapter 3: Testing the Impossible. Once the story of the hole entered the public consciousness, it ceased to be merely a curiosity. It became a problem, one that demanded answers. For Mel Waters, the questions were no longer abstract. The hole was on his land. It shaped his daily life. And whatever it was, it did not behave like anything he had encountered before. Mel did not set out to prove the existence of the paranormal. By his own admission, he was not a mystic, a scientist, or a thrill seeker. He was a landowner confronted with something deeply wrong, and his instinct was to test it. The first tests were simple, primitive even, but simplicity was part of their power. The hole had already demonstrated its most unsettling trait: silence. Objects disappeared into it without sound, no echo returned, not even a faint suggestion of impact. In normal environments, sound travels, even in deep wells, even through water. Silence of this kind suggested either unimaginable depth or conditions hostile to vibration itself. Mel returned repeatedly with fishing line, weights, and makeshift tools. Each time the result was the same. The line fed smoothly into the darkness, as if gravity itself was being gently neutralized. There was no sudden tug, no slack, no indication that the weight had encountered resistance. Over time, Mel stopped trying to reach the bottom. Instead, he focused on how the hole affected its surroundings. The animals noticed first. Mel's dogs reacted to the hole with a fear that bordered on aggression. They would approach only so far before stopping abruptly, growling at empty space. Sometimes they barked wildly. Other times they snapped their jaws as if something invisible stood between them and the pit. Attempts to coax them closer failed. Pulling on their leashes only increased their panic. This behavior was not limited to dogs. Birds avoided the area entirely. Mel could stand for hours near the hole and see nothing fly overhead, not even insects. No buzzing, no crawling. The land around the pit felt unnaturally sterile, as though life itself sensed a boundary that humans could not perceive. Mel began to suspect that the hole exerted some form of influence, subtle but undeniable. That suspicion deepened when he began experimenting with electronics. The radio test, which he described to Art Bell, was not a one-time fluke. Mel repeated it multiple times with similar results. As he approached the hole, the radio signal degraded. Static overwhelmed the broadcast. Step back and clarity returned. Step closer and the device behaved as if it had crossed into another broadcast zone entirely. What disturbed Mel most was not the interference, but the content. Music that did not belong to any contemporary station. Voices with outdated cadences. Baseball games whose details, players, scores, announcers matched recordings from decades earlier. It was as though the radio was no longer receiving signals from space, but from time. Mel tested other devices. Simple compasses behaved erratically, refusing to settle. Batteries drained faster than expected. Nothing failed dramatically, but nothing behaved normally either. At no point did Mel claim to understand what was happening, but he became increasingly convinced that the hole was not simply deep, it was disruptive. This realization prompted a more dangerous line of inquiry. Mel began asking what would happen if something living entered the hole. He did not begin with animals. Instead, he tried organic materials, meat scraps, bones, biological waste. Once again, the results were inconclusive. Everything disappeared. Nothing returned. Nothing reacted. But the stories from his neighbors lingered in his mind, particularly the account of the dog that came back. Mel had not witnessed the event himself, but he trusted the man who told it. And the detail that troubled him most was not that the dog returned. It was that the dog was no longer the same. It did not respond. It did not recognize its owner. It behaved like a copy without memory. The implication was terrifying. What if the whole did not kill? What if it changed? Mel never lowered an animal himself at this stage, but the idea followed him, intruding into his thoughts whenever he stood near the pit. He described feeling watched not from above but from below, as if the darkness itself was attentive. Then the attention turned toward him. Shortly after Mel's first appearance on Coast to Coast AM, the environment around his property changed. It began subtly. Strange vehicles drove past his land late at night, slowly, deliberately. Men he did not recognize walked the nearby roads, always moving on when questioned. Then came the helicopters, unmarked, flying low, sometimes hovering, sometimes passing overhead repeatedly, as if mapping the terrain by memory rather than instrument. Mel had lived on that land long enough to know what was normal. This was not. The timing was impossible to ignore. The activity began only after Mel spoke publicly. Mel continued testing the hole, but now with caution. He documented what he could. He avoided taking photographs, fearing that evidence might draw more attention. The hole, he felt, did not want to be documented. This was not a rational belief, but it was persistent. He noticed something else during this period. Time felt distorted near the hole. Visits that felt like minutes stretched into hours. The light changed faster than expected. Mel could not prove this sensation, but he trusted it. He began wearing a watch. He checked it compulsively. Sometimes he was certain it was wrong. The hole did not behave aggressively. It did not pull objects in. It did not emit light or sound. Its danger lay in its passivity, in its refusal to behave. Eventually, Mel attempted his most reckless experiment. He considered lowering himself. The idea came unbidden and refused to leave. He imagined a harness, a rope, a controlled descent. He imagined seeing the walls extend endlessly downward him and stone giving way to darkness, darkness giving way to something else. What stopped him was not fear, but certainty. Mel believed that if he entered the hole, he would not come back. Not dead, not alive, but altered. This conviction hardened into something like instinct, the same instinct that made animals recoil, the same instinct that warned early humans away from deep chasms long before science offered explanations. Before Mel could act on the thought, events overtook him. One afternoon, returning from town, he found the access road to his property blocked. Armed men stood at the perimeter. They wore uniforms without insignia. When Mel demanded an explanation, he was told there had been a plane crash. A recovery operation was underway. There was no wreckage, no smoke, no reports. Soon after, Mel was informed that his land had been reassessed. For reasons of environmental safety, it was now under federal jurisdiction. He was offered compensation, extraordinary compensation, on the condition that he sign a non-disclosure agreement and leave the country. The message was clear: stop testing, stop asking, leave. By the time Mel accepted the deal, his experiments had ended, but the hole had already done its work. It had reshaped his understanding of reality, and perhaps drawn attention from forces that understood it far better than he did. Testing the impossible had consequences, and Mel was about to learn that some experiments do not end when you walk away. Chapter 4: The Dog That Came Back. Every mystery has a moment when curiosity turns into fear. For Mel Waters, that moment came not with fishing line, radios, or helicopters, but with a dog. Until then, the hole had been an anomaly, disturbing, yes, but distant. It defied measurement, interfered with electronics, frightened animals, and resisted explanation. These things were unsettling, but they remained abstract. They could be discussed, debated, filed away as strange data points. The story of the dog changed that. It introduced something far more troubling than depth or silence. It introduced the possibility that the whole did not simply consume, but returned. Mel learned of the incident casually during a conversation with a neighboring landowner. He had been asking around trying to understand whether others had noticed the same strange behaviors in animals near the pit. He expected vague answers, mentions of odd sounds, maybe superstitions passed down through local folklore. Instead, he was told a story that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The neighbor explained that sometime earlier, his dog had died. The details were ordinary. The animal had grown old. It had become sick. One morning, it simply did not wake up. Living in a rural area, far from town and without access to proper disposal services, the man made a practical decision. He took the dog to the hole. The pit had long been used as a dumping site. Everyone in the area knew that. Trash went in. Scrap metal went in. Dead livestock went in. Nothing ever came back. It was final, convenient, silent. The man wrapped his dog's body as best he could, carried it to the edge and dropped it in. There was no sound. Days passed. Then, while walking through the woods near his property, the man noticed a dog moving between the trees. At first, he paid it little attention. Dogs roamed freely in the area, but something about the animal made him stop. It looked familiar. As he drew closer, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. The size, the shape, the color of the coat, even the collar, worn in the same way, hanging slightly crooked where the buckle never quite sat right. It was his dog. Alive. The man stood frozen, his mind scrambling for explanations. Grief does strange things to perception. Loss creates illusions. He called out the dog's name, expecting the animal to respond, to come running, tail wagging, eager for affection. Instead, the dog stopped. It looked at him, and then it ran. It did not limp. It did not hesitate. It fled into the trees with a speed and coordination no sick or dying animal should have possessed. The man followed, calling out, pushing through brush and branches, but the dog vanished as quickly as it had appeared. That was the end of the encounter. No reunion, no closure, no explanation. When the neighbor finished telling the story, he did not appear frightened. If anything, he seemed resigned, as though he had accepted that whatever had happened was beyond his ability to understand and beyond his power to change. Mel, however, could not let it go. The story embedded itself in his thoughts, replaying again and again. At night, he imagined the moment the dog emerged from the hole, or wherever the hole led. Had it climbed out? Had it been placed back into the world? Had it ever truly died? And if it had returned, what exactly had returned with it? The detail that disturbed Mel most was not the resurrection itself. Folklore was full of such stories. Myths spoke of animals returning from the dead, of spirits wearing familiar forms. What unsettled him was the behavior. The dog did not recognize its owner. It did not respond to its name. It did not behave like an animal reunited with someone it loved. It behaved like something else wearing the shape of a dog. This distinction mattered. In the days that followed, Mel found himself watching his own dogs more closely. He noticed subtle things he had ignored before. The way they stared at the hole, ears raised, bodies tense. The way they refused to cross an invisible boundary near the pit. The way their fear was not panicked, but deliberate, as though informed by something deeper than instinct. Animals, Mel believed, understood the hole in a way humans could not. They did not question it. They did not test it. They avoided it. Mel began to wonder whether the dog that returned had lost that understanding, or whether it had been stripped away. The idea that the hole could alter living beings opened a new and horrifying line of thought. If something entered the pit and came back, was it the same entity? Or was it a reconstruction, an imitation assembled from memory, matter, or something far less tangible? The hole, Mel realized, might not be a place of death. It might be a place of translation. This possibility recontextualized everything he had observed: the radio signals from the past, the absence of insects, the silence, the feeling of being watched. These were not random anomalies. They were symptoms, evidence of a boundary where normal rules no longer applied. Mel considered briefly whether the neighbor had lied, whether grief had distorted his memory. But the man had nothing to gain from telling the story. He did not seek attention. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He simply stated what he had seen and then moved on. That, in some ways, was the most unsettling part. If the dog had returned wrong, what would happen to a human? Mel had already toyed with the idea of lowering himself into the hole. After hearing the story, That thought became unbearable. He could not shake the image of himself emerging days later, alive perhaps, but unrecognizable, walking past his own family, ignoring his own name, a copy without continuity, a body without belonging. The hole, Mel began to suspect, did not destroy identity. It erased connection, and once erased, there was no guarantee it could ever be restored. From that moment on, Mel stopped referring to the hole as an object. In his private notes, he began calling it a presence, something that interacted with the world selectively, something that responded to life, not matter. He also noticed a change in himself. Standing near the hole for extended periods made him uneasy, not fearful, but disoriented. Time felt thin, thoughts wandered, memories surfaced uninvited. He found himself recalling moments from childhood with unnatural clarity, as though his mind were being quietly searched. He never told anyone this, but he believed the hole was listening. The story of the dog spread quietly through the area, passed between neighbors in hushed tones. No one attempted to retrieve the animal. No one tried to track it. Some things, the locals understood, were better left alone. Mel was not so sure. The dog that came back marked a threshold in the story of the hole. Before it, the mystery was external, something to be measured, tested, observed. After it, the mystery became personal. It raised questions that could not be answered with tools or data. What defines life? What defines death? And what remains when something crosses the boundary between them? Mel would soon learn that the hole was not finished revealing its nature. But from that moment on, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever lay beneath the earth was capable of returning what it took. And what it returned was never quite the same. Chapter 5. Government Intervention. There is a moment in every forbidden story when the mystery stops feeling accidental. For Mel Waters, that moment arrived quietly, without sirens, without warnings, without official notices. It arrived in the form of small disruptions, easily dismissed at first, yet impossible to ignore once they accumulated. It began with the roads. Late at night, unfamiliar vehicles drove slowly past Mel's property. They did not speed. They did not stop. They moved with deliberate restraint, as if observing rather than traveling. The drivers never waved. The headlights lingered longer than necessary. At first, Mel told himself it was nothing. Rural roads attracted curious travelers, hunters, surveyors, but the pattern repeated. Then came the pedestrians, men he did not recognize, walking the roads near his land without tools, without dogs, without purpose. When Mel tried to speak to them, they offered vague answers and kept moving. It was subtle surveillance, the kind that relies on being noticed. The helicopters followed soon after. They flew low and slow, sometimes circling, sometimes passing overhead in straight lines. They carried no visible markings, no identifying colors. They were not emergency craft. They were not news helicopters, and they did not belong to any civilian agency Mel recognized. Their presence unsettled the animals more than anything else. Birds scattered, livestock panicked, Mel's dogs hid. The hole, however, remained unchanged, silent, passive, waiting. Mel tried to convince himself that the activity was unrelated, that his appearance on a late-night radio show could not possibly draw federal attention, but the timing was too precise. Everything began after he spoke publicly, after the hole entered the national conversation, and then one afternoon, the situation escalated beyond doubt. Mel was returning home from town when he found the access road to his property blocked. Vehicles stood across the narrow dirt path. Men in military-style uniforms were positioned at intervals, rifles visible but not raised. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply denied entry. When Mel demanded an explanation, he was told there had been a plane crash on the property. A recovery operation was underway. The land was temporarily restricted for safety reasons. Mel knew immediately that this was a lie. There had been no reports of a crash, no smoke, no debris, no impact scars visible from the road. He could see the tree line clearly, and beyond it, the land appeared untouched. When he pressed further, asking to speak with someone in charge, a man in civilian clothing approached him. He spoke calmly, professionally, without hostility. Mel was informed that his property had been reassessed. Due to newly identified environmental concerns, the land now fell under federal jurisdiction. No explanation was offered. No appeal process was mentioned. The decision was final. What came next was even more disturbing. The man explained that the government was prepared to compensate Mel for the use of his land, not a one-time payment, not a modest settlement, $3 million per year. The condition was simple. Mel would sign a non-disclosure agreement. He would leave the country, and he would never return. The implication was unmistakable. This was not a negotiation. Mel understood the language of power well enough to recognize a threat when he heard one. The offer was generous precisely because refusal was not an option. The money was not compensation, it was insulation, a barrier between Mel and the consequences of further inquiry. Mel asked what would happen if he declined. The man did not answer directly. He did not need to. Mel signed. Within weeks, arrangements were made. His departure was swift, efficient, too efficient. There were no delays, no complications. Passports, visas, travel documents all appeared as if by design. Mel was sent to Australia, thousands of miles away from Washington State and even farther from the hole. From that moment on, Mel's life ceased to feel like his own. In Australia, he lived quietly. He did not speak publicly. He did not contact the media. He obeyed the terms of the agreement, not because he trusted it, but because he feared what breaking it might provoke. Yet even in exile, the hole followed him. He dreamed of it, not as an object, but as a space, an opening without edges, a darkness that did not recede when approached. Sometimes he dreamed of standing at its edge. Other times he dreamed of climbing out, always alone. During this period, Mel was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The prognosis was grim, 6 months, perhaps less. The diagnosis felt unreal, yet fitting, as though his body had begun to mirror the slow erasure of his former life. When the government contacted him again, it was not to check on his health. It was to ensure compliance. The message was clear: remain silent. 2 years passed. Eventually, Mel made a decision that defied both reason and self-preservation. He would return, not to reclaim his land, not to confront the authorities, but to speak. He contacted Art Bell. The call was brief, cautious. Mel explained that he had information, updates that needed to be shared. Art Bell, aware of the risks but unable to resist the gravity of the story, agreed to hear him out. Before Mel could fully re-enter public life, events intervened once again. Upon landing in the United States, Mel began traveling by bus to visit family. Somewhere along the route, an altercation broke out. Police were called. Passengers were questioned. Buses were reorganized. Mel never arrived. Instead, he awoke 12 days later in San Francisco. He had no memory of the missing time. Medical examinations revealed needle marks on his arms. Tape residue suggested intravenous lines. More disturbingly, several of his back teeth were gone. There was no pain, no infection, just absence. When Mel attempted to access his bank account, he discovered that the millions he had been paid for his land had vanished, not frozen, not disputed, gone. Mel returned to Washington. His property was unrecognizable. Neighbors told him that while he was gone, a large-scale operation had occupied the site. Equipment, personnel, structures. Then one day it all disappeared, packed up and removed without explanation. The hole was gone, filled, covered, erased. Officially, it had never existed. Mel's attempts to seek answers were futile. There were no records, no agencies acknowledged jurisdiction, no payments resumed. The agreement he had signed was unenforceable because on paper it did not exist. Mel had been used and discarded. The government intervention did not provide clarity, it provided silence. And in that silence, the most terrifying implication of all took shape. Whatever the hole was, it was not merely anomalous, it was valuable. Valuable enough to justify surveillance, valuable enough to justify displacement, valuable enough to justify erasure. Mel had believed he was testing the impossible. In truth, he had stumbled into something that others had been watching all along. And once the government stepped in, the rules changed. From that moment forward, Mel was no longer an investigator. He was evidence. And evidence, when inconvenient, is rarely allowed to speak. Chapter 6: Return, Abduction, and Memory Loss. Returning home was never supposed to happen. For Mel Waters, the decision to come back to the United States was not driven by courage or defiance, but by something far more fragile: the sense that silence was killing him faster than any disease ever could. Exile had stripped his life of context. Without the land, without the whole, without the story, he felt hollowed out, like a man shaped around an absence. Australia had been safe, too safe. No questions, no shadows, no helicopters, just distance. But distance did not erase memory, it sharpened it. Each night, the same images returned. The black circle in the ground, the rope descending endlessly, the sound that never came back. When Mel contacted Art Bell again, his voice carried a different weight. It was quieter, slower, less certain. He did not sound like a witness eager to testify. He sounded like someone trying to prove to himself that he was still real. Art listened. They agreed to speak again once Mel was stateside. Mel booked his return quietly. No press, no announcements. He traveled light, avoiding attention, choosing public transportation rather than flights whenever possible. It was not paranoia, at least not entirely. He had learned that official interest did not announce itself. It simply appeared. Somewhere between Seattle and California, everything stopped. The bus was crowded, ordinary. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Mel remembered the rhythm of the road, the faint smell of diesel, the low murmur of half-asleep passengers. He remembered closing his eyes. He did not remember opening them. 12 days later, Mel woke up in a hospital room in San Francisco. The ceiling was unfamiliar, the light too bright. His body felt wrong, not injured, but altered, as though it had been rearranged and returned incorrectly. There was no clock in view, no calendar, no immediate sense of time. When he asked where he was, the nurse hesitated before answering. When he asked how long he had been there, the hesitation grew longer. 12 days. Mel had no memory of them. Medical records listed him as a transient, found disoriented, dehydrated, no identification, no accompanying belongings, no emergency contact, no explanation for how he arrived. There were inconsistencies, small ones at first. Bruises along his arms that did not match any reported fall. Faint puncture marks near the veins, partially healed. Rectangular impressions on his wrists and ankles, as if restraints had been applied and removed with care. Most disturbing of all, several of his back teeth were missing. Not broken, removed. There was no swelling, no trauma, no sign of infection. Dental extraction performed under sterile conditions. When Mel asked hospital staff about it, no one could explain. There were no dental records attached to his admission, no surgeon listed, no consent forms. It was as if the procedure had never officially occurred. Mel's sense of self began to fracture. He knew who he was. He knew where he had come from. But there was now a section of his life that had been cut out cleanly, leaving no emotional residue. No fear, no pain, just absence. This frightened him more than any nightmare could have. Trauma usually leaves echoes, flashbacks, panic, emotional distortion. But Mel experienced none of these. Whatever had happened during those 12 days had been erased with surgical precision, not suppressed, not buried, but removed. After his release, Mel attempted to regain control of his life. He checked his bank accounts. They were empty, not frozen, not seized, not flagged for investigation. Empty. Years of payments, millions of dollars, had vanished without transaction history, without withdrawal records, without explanation. Calls to banks led nowhere. Paperwork contradicted itself. Some accounts appeared never to have existed at all. The agreement he had signed, his supposed protection, was meaningless now. Mel returned to Washington. He needed to see the land. He needed proof that something had been real. When he arrived, the final erasure revealed itself. The property bore scars, not of nature but of industry. The earth had been leveled, access roads carved and then removed, vegetation disturbed, then replanted in uneven patterns. It was the kind of restoration meant to hide activity, not heal damage. And the whole was gone. Not collapsed, not fenced, gone. Neighbors spoke cautiously. Some refused to speak at all. Others described months of activity while Mel was abroad. Heavy machinery, personnel, temporary structures erected and dismantled with military efficiency. Then one day everything vanished. No signs, no explanation, as if the land had been reset. Mel searched for records, deeds, surveys, environmental reports. None mentioned the whole. Some maps contradicted others. Coordinates shifted subtly between documents, enough to introduce doubt without triggering suspicion. Reality itself seemed to be cooperating in the erasure. Mel attempted to speak publicly again. Each attempt failed. Interviews canceled without explanation. Phone calls disconnected. Emails unanswered. Friends advised him to stop. Family members expressed concern, not for his safety, but for his sanity. He began to question himself, not the whole, not the events, but his right to remember. Memory is a fragile thing. We trust it because we must. But when the world around you denies your experiences, when documents disagree and witnesses vanish into silence, memory becomes a liability. Mel wondered if that was the point, to not kill the witness, but to isolate him inside his own recollection. Over time, Mel noticed something else. His dreams had changed. The whole no longer appeared as a place. It appeared as a sensation, a pressure behind the eyes, a pull without direction. Sometimes he woke convinced that something had been taken, not during the 12 days, but afterward. Something subtle, something he could not name. He began recording himself. Notes, audio journals, video fragments. He feared that if memory could be removed once, it could be removed again. And perhaps it already had. The most terrifying possibility was not that Mel had been abducted. It was that he had been returned with intention, returned altered. Whatever had happened during those missing days was not meant to harm him physically. There was no brutality, no chaos. Everything about the event suggested control, precision, purpose. He had not been punished, he had been processed. In the end, Mel spoke one last time. Not to accuse, not to expose, but to warn. He told Art Bell that if anything happened to him again, if he disappeared, if his memory fractured further, it would not be an accident. It would not be illness. It would be continuation. Because once you discover something the world is not ready to acknowledge, you do not get to go back to being ordinary. The hole had been sealed, the land reclaimed, the money erased, but the damage had already been done. Mel Waters had looked into something that did not want to be seen, and when he returned, the world made sure he would never be whole again. Not dead, just incomplete. Chapter 7, The Second Hole, Nevada. If Mel Waters' story ended with the disappearance of the hole in Washington, it could be dismissed as a singular anomaly, an isolated incident consumed by rumor, paranoia, or personal trauma. But it did not end there, because years later, in a place defined by emptiness and secrecy, another hole surfaced. This one was not surrounded by forests or farmland. It lay in the open deserts of Nevada, a state already synonymous with classified projects, restricted airspace, and questions that never receive official answers. A place where the ground itself has been reshaped repeatedly by experiments no one was meant to see. And like the first, the second hole did not announce itself. It was discovered by accident. The man who found it was not a scientist or a government contractor. He was a prospector, an aging desert wanderer who spent his days moving between abandoned claims and forgotten trails, searching not for riches, but for solitude. His name has never been verified. In later retellings, he is referred to only as Jack. Jack stumbled upon the hole while tracking a wounded animal. The trail led him far from marked paths into a region of low hills and dry rock formations. From a distance, the land looked ordinary, dust, scrub, silence stretching to the horizon. Then the ground opened. The hole was circular, nearly perfect, roughly 9 feet in diameter, too precise to be natural. Jack approached cautiously, expecting to hear something: wind, loose gravel, the echo of falling stones. Instead, he heard nothing at all. He dropped a rock. It vanished into darkness without a sound. No impact, just absence. Jack did what Mel Waters had done years earlier. He tested it. He tied rope after rope together, lowering them slowly into the void. The rope slid downward without resistance. When the final length was fed in, there was still no tension, no bottom, no sound. Jack felt the same sensation Mel had described, not fear, but disorientation. The hole did not feel dangerous in a conventional sense. It felt wrong, like a missing piece of the world. He marked the location and left. That night, he did not sleep. Something about the hole lingered in his thoughts, not as an image, but as a presence. The sense that it was not merely there, but aware of having been found. The next day, Jack returned with equipment: more rope, measuring tools, a handheld compass. The compass behaved erratically near the hole, its needle wavering without settling. Jack assumed mineral interference, iron deposits perhaps, but the ground readings did not support that explanation. Over the following weeks, Jack told a small number of people. That was his mistake. The desert is vast, but information travels quickly through its hidden networks. Prospectors, hunters, off-grid communities, people accustomed to noticing when things change. Word reached ears Jack never intended to reach. The response was swift. Unmarked vehicles appeared near the area. Roads were blocked. Temporary fencing went up without signage. A notice appeared declaring the land restricted under federal authority, citing environmental hazards and public safety concerns. Jack was questioned, not aggressively, methodically. He was asked how long he had known about the hole, whether he had shared its location, whether he had taken photographs, whether anyone else had been there. The questions were not about discovery. They were about containment. Jack was released without charges, but with a warning. The land was now off limits. Trespassing would result in arrest. Further discussion of the site would be unwise. When Jack returned to the area weeks later, the hole was gone, not filled with debris, not collapsed, covered with a structure, temporary, functional, and heavily guarded. The pattern was unmistakable. When reports of the Nevada hole began circulating quietly in late-night forums and fringe radio shows, listeners noticed something unsettling. The description matched Mel's hole almost exactly. Same diameter, same silence, same refusal to yield depth. 2 holes, hundreds of miles apart, identical behavior. This raised a question far more disturbing than the existence of a single anomaly. What if these holes were not accidents? What if they were nodes? Points in a larger system, distributed, monitored, and controlled. Nevada, after all, was no stranger to secret infrastructure. Underground facilities, test sites, and experimental projects had reshaped vast regions of the state. Entire towns had been built and erased to support classified work. But this was different. No drilling records, no seismic disturbances, no spoil piles. The hole appeared without excavation, as if the ground had been removed rather than displaced. Mel, upon hearing rumors of the Nevada hole, reacted with a mixture of dread and vindication. He had feared this, that the hole was not unique, that his experience was not an anomaly, but a glimpse. He contacted Art Bell one final time, describing the similarities in detail. Art, cautious but intrigued, recognized the implications immediately. If multiple holes existed and were being systematically sealed, then Mel's story was no longer personal. It was procedural. Someone knew about these holes long before the public did. Someone had protocols. The government's reaction no longer looked like panic. It looked like familiarity. The idea that these holes might be connected to each other or to something deeper began to take shape. Some speculated about underground networks. Others suggested experimental physics, localized space-time anomalies, gravitational sinks, or gateways. But none of these theories explained the silence, or the lack of resistance, or the way objects simply disappeared without trace. The most unsettling possibility was this: the holes were not entrances, they were exits, places where matter, and perhaps information, left our reality entirely. And if that were true, then sealing them was not about protecting the public. It was about preventing loss. Loss of what? No one could say. The second hole confirmed what Mel had always suspected. The world beneath our feet is not fully mapped, not fully understood, and not fully under our control. If one hole could be dismissed as madness, 2 suggested design. And design implies intent. Somewhere beneath the deserts of Nevada, beneath forests long since erased from maps, beneath land quietly reclaimed by authority, something exists that does not belong to the surface world. Something that opens, something that waits, and when it is found, it is buried again. Not because it is dangerous, but because it is known. Chapter 8: The Miracle and Disappearance. Miracles are comforting until they demand an explanation. For Mel Waters, the miracle arrived quietly, without ceremony or witnesses. There were no doctors celebrating, no test results pinned to a wall in disbelief. There was only a body that no longer behaved as it was supposed to. Months after his return, after the lost time and the erasure of his land, Mel was still living under the shadow of a terminal diagnosis. The cancer had been real, the scans had been clear, the prognosis had been final. 6 months, that was what he'd been given. But 6 months passed, then 12, and nothing happened. The pain that should have arrived never did. The weakness never came. The slow, predictable decline simply failed to materialize. Follow-up examinations revealed something no one could explain. The cancer was gone, Not shrinking, not dormant, gone. Doctors use careful language. Spontaneous remission. Statistical anomaly. Rare but documented. They avoided eye contact when Mel asked the obvious question, how? Medicine had no answer. Mel did. He did not say it aloud, but he knew. Something had happened during the 12 days he could not remember. Something had reached into his body and rewritten it. The miracle did not feel like a gift. It felt like a consequence. Mel began to suspect that his survival was not incidental, that it was part of the same process that had removed his memory, his money, his land. The same process that had sealed the hole and erased its coordinates from official reality. He had been altered, corrected, returned to function. This realization unsettled him more than the cancer ever had. Illness is cruel, but it is natural. Healing without cause is something else entirely. It introduces agency where there should be none. It suggests intent, and intent implies ownership. Mel spoke of the miracle only once publicly. During a brief, guarded conversation with Art Bell, he mentioned that he no longer believed he was dying. Art, stunned, pressed for details. Mel refused to elaborate. "I don't think it's over," he said instead. "I think it's waiting." From that moment on, Mel's fear shifted. He no longer feared death. He feared relevance. Because if something had intervened to save him, then he was no longer expendable. He was no longer a loose end. He was a variable that had been deliberately preserved, and variables are monitored. Mel noticed subtle changes. Strangers appeared again. Different faces, same behavior. Phone calls dropped mid-sentence. Letters arrived already opened. He felt watched, not in the overt way of surveillance, but in the quiet, administrative sense of being tracked by systems rather than people. More disturbingly, he felt watched from somewhere else, not above, below. The dreams returned. This time, the hole was no longer empty. It was filled with light, not bright, not warm, but clinical, like the inside of a laboratory. He felt no fear in these dreams, only observation, as though something were checking his condition, assessing. One night he woke with the certainty that he was not alone. The room was silent, unchanged, but the feeling remained, an awareness pressing inward, as if the space itself had leaned closer. Mel began to prepare, not for escape, for disappearance. He withdrew from friends. He stopped answering calls. He stopped documenting his experiences. He destroyed notes, recordings, anything that might connect him to the holes or the events surrounding them. If erasure was inevitable, he would not make it easy. The last confirmed sighting of Mel Waters occurred on an ordinary afternoon. No dramatic farewell, no final broadcast. He was seen entering a diner near his former property, speaking briefly with the owner, then leaving on foot. He never arrived home. His vehicle was later found parked neatly, keys inside. No signs of struggle, no indication of haste. His wallet remained, his identification untouched. He had simply stopped. Authorities classified the case as a missing person. No foul play suspected, no evidence to pursue. The investigation stalled almost immediately. There were no appeals, no media attention, no urgency, as if no one expected him to be found. Those who knew Mel best understood the pattern too well to accept coincidence. He had not vanished randomly. He had followed the same trajectory as the holes themselves. Discovery, intervention, erasure. The miracle and the disappearance were inseparable. One did not precede the other. They were part of the same exchange. If Mel had been healed, it was not because he was valued as a person, but because he was valuable as a subject. Something had learned from him, tested through him, corrected him. And once that purpose was fulfilled, there was no further need for his presence on the surface. This reframes the story entirely. The hole did not take the dog because it was hungry. It returned the dog because it could. It did not heal Mel because it was benevolent. It healed him because it was capable. And capability without explanation is the most dangerous form of power. Mel Waters did not disappear in spite of the miracle. He disappeared because of it, because survival had made him proof. Proof that the hole was not merely a void, but a system, one that interacted with life, one that altered outcomes, one that decided what was returned and what was retained. In the end, Mel may not have been silenced. He may have been reclaimed, taken back into the process that had briefly released him. And if that is true, then the greatest misunderstanding surrounding the holes is this: they are not places where things fall. They are places where things are processed, filtered, selected. And once you pass through, whether willingly or not, you do not belong entirely to this world anymore. Mel Waters survived the impossible, and then, quietly, he became part of it. Chapter 9. Skeptics vs. Believers. Every mystery reaches a point where the story splits. On one side stand the skeptics, those who demand evidence, measurements, documentation, and repeatability. On the other stand the believers, those who argue that not everything meaningful leaves behind proof, and that absence itself can be a form of evidence. The case of Mel's hole lives precisely in that fracture. To skeptics, the story collapses under the weight of its own claims. A hole more than 15 miles deep violates every known principle of geology. The Earth's crust simply cannot support such a structure. Heat and pressure increase dramatically with depth. Any shaft approaching even a fraction of Mel's claimed measurements would collapse long before reaching the mantle. Fishing line would melt, sound would travel, gravity would reveal itself in unmistakable ways. None of this happened. Furthermore, no physical location has ever been verified. No survey records list a bottomless pit near Ellensburg, Washington. No property deeds confirm ownership by anyone named Mel Waters in Kittitas County. Extensive searches by journalists, researchers, and amateur explorers have failed to locate the hole. When satellite imagery revealed dark circular depressions in the area, each was eventually identified as an abandoned well, mine shaft, or natural sinkhole. Deep perhaps, but never bottomless. To skeptics, this is not suppression. It is absence. They argue that Mel Waters fits a familiar archetype, a solitary narrator, unverifiable, operating just beyond the reach of documentation. Late-night radio, they point out, thrives on ambiguity. Coast to Coast AM was a platform where extraordinary claims required no immediate proof, only an engaging voice and a receptive audience. From this perspective, Mel's hole is not a phenomenon. It is a story, a modern campfire tale, refined over repeated tellings. Each new call added a layer: government intervention, memory loss, miraculous healing. The escalation follows a recognizable pattern, one seen in folklore throughout history. The longer a story survives, the more elaborate it becomes. Believers see the same facts and draw the opposite conclusion. They argue that the lack of evidence is not a weakness, but the central feature of the case. If the whole represented something outside conventional reality, why would it obey the rules of documentation? Why would it remain stable, visible, and accessible? The sudden military involvement, the alleged reassignment of land, and the disappearance of physical traces are interpreted not as narrative convenience, but as active suppression. To believers, the absence of Mel Waters from public records suggests not fabrication, but deliberate erasure. The timing raises uncomfortable questions. Skeptics have proposed that Mel exploited blacked-out satellite imagery to bolster his claims, except the imagery in question did not exist when Mel first told his story. TerraServer, the platform often cited in debunking attempts, launched months after Mel's initial broadcast. If Mel was inventing a cover story, he did so with information that had not yet entered public knowledge. Believers also point to the consistency of Mel's demeanor. Across multiple calls spanning several years, his tone remained calm, restrained, and internally consistent. He did not embellish emotionally. He did not attempt to monetize the story. He refused interviews, declined publicity, and avoided specifics that would draw attention to exact locations. This behavior does not align with typical hoaxes. Then there are the effects: animals refusing to approach the hole, electronics malfunctioning, radio broadcasts bleeding through time. These phenomena, believers argue, echo reports from other alleged anomalies, areas where electromagnetic disturbances, geological stress, or unknown variables disrupt normal perception. The resurrected dog is often cited as the most implausible element of the story. Skeptics dismiss it outright, labeling it narrative escalation. Believers counter that resurrection is not the claim. Duplication is. The dog did not behave the same. It did not recognize its owner. It returned altered, not restored. This distinction matters. It reframes the whole not as a source of life, but as a process, one that copies, transforms, and releases without concern for continuity or identity. The same logic is applied to Mel's healing. Spontaneous remission is statistically rare, but medically documented. Skeptics see coincidence. Believers see pattern. A man exposed to two anomalous pits loses time, undergoes unexplained medical procedures, and emerges cancer-free. Probability alone, they argue, does not account for sequence. At the center of the debate is a deeper philosophical divide. Skeptics insist that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Without physical proof, the story remains fiction. Interesting, unsettling, but ultimately unsubstantiated. Believers respond that this standard assumes all phenomena are obligated to be observable within existing frameworks. What if they are not? What if the whole was not a place, but an event, not a structure, but an interaction? Something that appears briefly, performs its function, and withdraws, leaving behind only altered outcomes, unreliable memories. In that case, evidence would not be lost. It would be irrelevant. Both sides accuse the other of comfort-seeking. Skeptics find comfort in closure, in the reassurance that the world operates within known limits. Believers find comfort in mystery, in the idea that reality still holds undiscovered depths. Yet neither side can fully dismiss the other. Skeptics cannot explain why the story persists, why it continues to resurface decades later, refined but unchanged at its core. Believers cannot explain why no definitive proof has ever emerged, despite advances in technology and countless attempts to locate the site. The truth may not belong entirely to either camp. Mel's whole exists in a space where belief and disbelief overlap, where the story itself becomes the artifact. Its power lies not in what it proves, but in what it destabilizes. It challenges assumptions about evidence, authority, and the limits of human understanding. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that Mel lied, nor that he told the truth, but that the story functions independently of both, that it persists because it describes something real, not in a geographic sense, but in a psychological one, a shared anxiety about what lies beneath the surface, a suspicion that the world contains systems we do not control and doors we are not meant to open. In the end, skeptics and believers are asking the same question from opposite directions. Not did it happen, but what would it mean if it did? And that question, once asked, refuses to disappear. Conclusion: a story that refuses to end. Every story ends, at least most of them do. They resolve into facts, fade into obscurity, or are replaced by newer mysteries that better fit the age that follows. Time has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of the unknown, filing it into history, folklore, or fiction. But some stories resist that process. They remain unfinished, not because information is missing, but because closure was never an option. Mel's Hole is one of those stories. Nearly 3 decades have passed since a quiet voice first described a silent pit on a late-night radio show. In that time, technology has advanced beyond anything imaginable in 1997. Satellites can read license plates from orbit. Drones map the seafloor in high definition. Algorithms predict human behavior with unsettling accuracy. And yet, the hole remains unverified. No coordinates, no measurements, no photographs that withstand scrutiny. Only a narrative, persistent, adaptable, and disturbingly coherent. This absence should have killed the story. Instead, it preserved it, because Mel's Hole was never sustained by evidence. It was sustained by implication, by the sense that something had been glimpsed briefly, then withdrawn, not disproven, but removed. In a world saturated with data, what cannot be archived becomes powerful. The Hole functions as a mirror. To skeptics, it reflects the dangers of credulity, a cautionary tale about how easily imagination can outrun reason, especially when amplified by media and repetition. It is proof that humans will invent depth where none exists, simply because the idea of an unseen bottom is more compelling than a closed explanation. To believers, the mirror shows something else entirely, a reminder that reality does not owe us transparency, that systems larger than humanity may operate according to rules we cannot access, let alone document. In this reflection, Mel's disappearance is not a failure of proof, but confirmation of interference. Both interpretations survive because neither can fully erase the other. And perhaps that is the point. Mel's Hole endures because it occupies a space that modern thinking finds uncomfortable. It challenges the assumption that everything can be located, measured, and resolved. It suggests that some phenomena are not meant to be found again once encountered, that discovery itself may trigger containment. The story also endures because it is fundamentally human. Strip away the whole, the government, the miracles, and what remains is a familiar pattern. A man encounters something extraordinary. He speaks about it. Authority responds. The narrative fragments. The man disappears. This pattern predates radio, predates science, it predates recorded history. It appears in myths of forbidden knowledge, in religious visions, in warnings passed down as allegory. The names change, the setting changes, the structure remains. Mel Waters was not the first to claim that the earth hides doors instead of depths, and he will not be the last. What makes his story linger is not the hole itself, but the cost of acknowledging it. Mel lost his land, his money vanished, his memory fractured. His identity dissolved into uncertainty. Whether through deception, delusion, or design, the result was the same. He was erased from the surface narrative. That erasure feels intentional, even if it was not. Because we live in a world where most stories are rewarded with attention. This one was punished with silence. That contradiction unsettles us. It suggests that some stories are dangerous not because they are false, but because they point in directions we are not equipped to follow. Towards systems that do not recognize human importance. Toward processes that do not distinguish between experiment and consequence. If Mel's hole was real, then the most terrifying possibility is not what lay at the bottom. It is that the hole did not care who looked into it. And if it was a hoax, then it succeeded far beyond its creator's control, evolving into something that continues to disturb precisely because it refuses to be pinned down. Either way, the story achieves the same effect. It destabilizes certainty. It leaves us standing at the edge of an absence, listening for a sound that never comes. The final irony is this. Mel's hole may not exist anywhere in Washington state. It may not exist in Nevada. It may not exist physically at all, but it exists where it matters, in the uneasy space between what we know and what we assume, in the suspicion that beneath the surface of the ground, of institutions, of reality itself, there are mechanisms we do not control, and perhaps never will. Stories like this refuse to end because they serve a purpose. They remind us that the world is not fully mapped, that progress does not eliminate mystery, it only changes its shape. Mel Waters is gone, the hole is gone, but the question remains, not where was it, not was it real, but what happens when something looks back from below and decides we are not finished yet? As long as that question lingers, the story does not end. It waits, just like the hole.
Shadows crawl where the light won't go. A